She dismissed him in front of 11 board members, 2 legal advisors, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the St. Lawrence. Nadine Laurier did it without raising her voice, without looking up from her notes, with the particular efficiency of someone who had more important things to tend to. The man she dismissed was wearing a canvas jacket and carrying a paper bag from the Tim Hortons in the lobby. He smiled when the security officer touched his shoulder, which was the first thing that should have told her something. It didn't. 47 minutes later, her phone rang. $380 million gone, and the man in the canvas jacket was the one who had taken it with him. If you're watching from your city right now, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. Stay with me until the end. This story gets harder before it gets better. The morning had started the way dangerous mornings always did. Quietly, without ceremony, dressed up to look like any other Tuesday. Nadine Laurier woke at 5:43 to an alarm she didn't need because she hadn't really slept. She lay in the dark of her condo on the 22nd floor in Griffintown, listening to the city find itself below her, and thought about the number. 380 million. She'd said it so many times over the past 2 months that it had stopped feeling like money. It felt more like a verdict now, something handed down. She'd been running Laurier Environmental Solutions for 6 years. She'd taken the CEO chair at 31 after her father's second surgery, when it had become clear he wasn't coming back to the office, and clearer still that if she didn't step in, the board would dismantle what he'd spent 22 years assembling. She'd fought for it. She had the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from winning fights that never actually end. Today, though, today was supposed to be different. She made coffee in the kitchen while it was still dark outside, the old way, stovetop, not the machine her assistant had ordered and she'd never unboxed. She stood at the window while it brewed and watched the lights of the Jacques Cartier Bridge and tried to believe the day was going to go the way she needed it to go. The Alderton Capital Partnership was the thing that ended the word probably. Without significant outside investment before the second quarter, Laurier Environmental was solvent but stalled. They could survive probably. Her CFO, Renata, had been saying probably for 3 months in a way that made the floor feel less solid every time. The Alderton deal was supposed to make the floor solid again. Thomas Alderton was not a man who appeared in profiles. He didn't speak at industry conferences. He didn't maintain a public presence of any kind, which was itself a kind of presence. What he had was a track record that other investors mentioned in a specific tone of voice, the one people used when they didn't want to seem like they were bragging by association. 23 years, exceptional returns. The kind of reputation that existed entirely through word of mouth among people who had more money than reasons to discuss it. Nadine had spent 4 weeks preparing for this meeting. Full team, late nights, 2 complete overhauls of the presentation, 1 restructuring of the financial projections, and a personal review of every slide until she could recite them in sequence without the screen. Her board chair, Philip Sauve, had been enthusiastic in the way that board chairs were when they could sense a deal closing. "This is exactly the kind of capital partner we need," he'd said over dinner the week before. "Alderton money changes the conversation." She'd believed him. She had believed all of it. The coffee was ready. She poured it into a mug with a chip in the handle that she'd kept for 3 years because her daughter Maisie had given it to her for Mother's Day, and the chip had happened on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday, and somehow that made it more hers than before. She was in the car by 7:15. Her assistant, Jonah, was already at his desk when she arrived, which meant he'd been there since at least 6:45, which meant he knew the day mattered. He had the particular focus of someone who had been briefed and had taken the briefing seriously. "Morning," he said. "AV is sorted. Catering confirmed. Renata's already in the prep room, and she looks like she hasn't slept either, which honestly I find reassuring. Who confirmed Alderton's arrival?" His office confirmed 2 people. A portfolio director named Sylvie Okafor and Mr. Alderton himself. "They have visitor passes waiting at reception." Jonah paused. "Also, the coffee order came with oat milk instead of regular. I've called them." Nadine set her bag down. "Does it matter?" Jonah looked at her over his notepad. "It matters to the kind of morning where everything needs to be right." She almost smiled. "Fix it." She spent the next 20 minutes at her desk going through the presentation one final time. Not because she needed to, but because motion felt better than stillness. And stillness right now had too much room for the things she was trying not to think about. Which was what happened if this didn't close. The prep meeting on 31 was already full when she walked in at 7:50. Renata at the head of the table with her annotated copy of the deck. 2 analysts with laptops, the communications lead. 3 people from legal who had spent the past week with the term sheet. They ran through it in 40 minutes. Clean, tight, coherent. The narrative held, the numbers held. Nadine answered every hypothetical Renata threw without hesitation. "You're ready," Renata said when they finished. Nadine nodded. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was, "I've been ready for 4 weeks. I need this to be over." The boardroom on 32 was the best room in the building. 2 sides of glass, a table that seated 18, and a view of the river that on clear days looked like something people painted. Today was a clear day. The kind that felt like a promise before you knew better. She was there at 9:35, 15 minutes early. She adjusted the seating, confirmed the screen, drank half a glass of water, the room filled with executives she'd worked alongside for years. Philip arrived at 9:52, unhurried in the way that certain men at certain levels had learned to perform as its own kind of power. He made his circuit of the room, a handshake here, a comment there, and settled into his seat at the far end of the table. Alderton Capital's people were expected at 10 sharp. At 9:58, the boardroom door opened. Nadine was mid-sentence with Renata when she felt the room shift. It was a subtle thing, the kind of atmospheric adjustment you felt before you saw, the way a room recalibrates around an unexpected variable. She turned. A man was standing near the door. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40. Medium height, no particular announcement in the way he stood, which was itself unusual. Most people who entered rooms like this were either performing confidence or suppressing nerves. This man was doing neither. He was simply present. He was wearing dark trousers and a canvas jacket with no visible logo. He was holding a Tim Hortons bag, the small one, from the lobby cafe downstairs. He was looking at the river through the windows with the mild appreciation of someone who had seen a lot of rivers. "Excuse me." One of the junior associates, a 26-year-old named Curtis, who had been specifically tasked with managing arrivals, materialized at the man's elbow. "Can I help you?" The man turned. He had an open face, calm eyes, and an expression that was not blank so much as unhurried, the expression of someone who had heard this particular question before and was in no rush to answer it. "I'm good," he said. His voice was even, unremarkable. "Thanks. This is a closed meeting," Curtis said, with the commitment of someone who had been given an instruction and intended to execute it. "Are you with the catering team?" Something moved through the man's expression. Not offense, more like a private note being taken. "No," he said. "I'm not. Do you have a confirmation? A pass?" "I don't have a pass, no." Curtis straightened slightly. "Then I need to ask you to wait in reception until Curtis." Nadine had crossed the room without quite deciding to, mostly because she needed the 10 o'clock to start on time and didn't need the interruption. She looked at the man. Something about him nagged at the edge of her recognition, like a word she knew but couldn't place. "I'm sorry, who are you here to see?" The man looked at her. His expression didn't shift. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, he said. Nadine glanced at Renata, who was already looking at her tablet, then back at the door. Alderton Capital had confirmed 2 people, Sylvie Okafor and Thomas Alderton. She looked at the man with the canvas jacket and the Tim Hortons bag. He looked back at her without apparent concern. She should have stopped there. She would understand later, lying awake at 2 in the morning on the 3rd night after, that the moment had been right there, completely available to her, that all she had needed to do was say, "What's your name?" and the entire day would have gone differently. She didn't say it. "I'm sorry," she said, using the voice she'd built over 6 years for exactly these kinds of moments, the efficient, forward-moving voice that kept things on track. "This meeting is for confirmed guests only. If you're with the Alderton team, your name would be on the list at reception. If you can have someone call up." "He's cleared," said a voice from the doorway. Nadine turned. Sylvie Okafor had arrived. 40s, sharp suit, leather portfolio, and an expression that Nadine could not quite read, except that it contained something careful in it, the expression of someone watching a situation and making a decision about whether to intervene. She was looking at the man in the canvas jacket. "He's cleared," Sylvie said again. Her voice was controlled and slightly tight. "Then he's absolutely welcome." Curtis started. "Curtis." Philip's voice came from the far end of the table, not looking up from his phone. "Handle it." And Curtis handled it the way a 26-year-old handles something when the instruction comes from the board chair and the clock says 9:59. He put a hand near the man's elbow, not quite touching. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step out. You can wait in reception and someone will come find you." The man looked down at Curtis's hand. Then he looked at Nadine. She was already looking at Renata. The screen was ready. The clock said 9:59. She turned away. She heard the slight movement, the door. The soft sound of a room closing around an absence. She looked at Sylvie Okafor, who was standing in the doorway and not sitting down. "Monsieur Okafor, welcome. We're ready to start." Sylvie looked at her for a moment. It was a specific kind of look, the look of someone who has something to say and is choosing, in real time, whether to say it. "Mr. Alderton comes separately," Sylvie said. "He's not with me." She walked to her seat. She placed her portfolio on the table. She looked at the presentation screen and said nothing else. Nadine looked at the door. Something cold moved through her from the inside. The meeting started on time. Nadine presented. She was good at this, had been doing it long enough that she could run the pitch on a kind of professional autopilot while part of her brain operated in a separate, quieter register. She made the case. She walked through the numbers. She answered Sylvie's 2 questions precisely. Thomas Alderton's empty chair sat at the corner of the table, and no one mentioned it, because in rooms like this, the empty chair was the thing no one mentioned directly. They arranged themselves around it and talked about everything else. At 10:44, her phone buzzed under the table. She ignored it. At 10:46, it buzzed again. At 10:48, Jonah opened the boardroom door and looked at her with an expression that said now. She closed the presentation with 2 minutes of prepared remarks she could have delivered in her sleep, thanked the room for its time, and called a 5-minute break. She was in the hallway before the door finished closing. Jonah was 2 steps away, holding her phone like it was something fragile. "You need to see this." She took the phone. The email was from Thomas Alderton's office. 5 sentences. Alderton Capital was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a potential partnership with Laurier Environmental Solutions, effective immediately. The decision was final and not subject to review. Future inquiries should be directed to their legal counsel. The 5th sentence said, "We wish Laurier Environmental continued success." She read it twice. She was aware of her breathing. Slow, deliberate, the way she breathed when she couldn't afford to show what was happening. "When did this come in?" 10:42, Jonah said. 4 minutes ago. 42 minutes since the meeting had started. 42 minutes since the man with the canvas jacket had been walked to reception with his paper bag. "Jonah, yeah, what does Thomas Alderton look like?" Jonah was quiet for a second. Then he took the phone back, pulled something up, and handed it to her. The photograph was modest, plain background, professional but not posed, almost deliberately unremarkable. Nadine looked at the photograph. The photograph looked back. She handed the phone to Jonah. She stood in the hallway with the city visible through the glass at the end of the corridor and said nothing for a long moment. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "You have 3, Jonah said. "They'll come looking." She went to the bathroom at the end of the hall. She ran cold water over her wrists, a thing her mother had taught her when she was 15, and her hands shook before swim meets. "The cold brings you back to your body," her mother had said. When your mind is trying to leave the building, she stood at the sink and looked at herself. 4 weeks of preparation. A restructured pitch, the right coffee order, and she had turned away from a man standing at the window of her own boardroom without asking his name. She dried her hands. She walked back in and told the room the meeting was concluded, that follow-up communications would come from her office, that she thanked everyone for their time. She said it steadily and didn't explain. Philip came back in after the room had emptied. She hadn't heard the door. "What happened?" he said. "We lost it." He made a sound of surprise that was very well performed. "How?" The presentation was fine. She looked at him. "I need to think." He sat down across from her. He put his hands together on the table in the way he did when he wanted to appear thoughtful and said, "Did something go wrong? Before the meeting? I need to think, Philip." He nodded slowly. Put a hand on the table, patted it twice. She had always found that gesture strange, and stood. "We'll find another way," he said. "We always do." He left. Nadine sat in the empty boardroom and looked at Thomas Alderton's empty chair and turned those 4 words over in her head. "We'll find another way." She didn't know yet why they made the back of her neck feel cold. She didn't go home until after 9. She sat at her desk after the floor had emptied and rebuilt the morning the way she used to rebuild bad races after swim meets, stroke by stroke, moment by moment. The man had walked in at 9:58. He'd been holding a Tim Hortons bag. He'd said, "I'm here for the 10 o'clock. Sylvie Okafor had said, "He comes separately." Curtis had touched his elbow. She had turned away. There had been a version of that morning where she'd looked at him more carefully, where she'd noticed the particular quality of his stillness, not shyness, not anxiety, just the complete absence of the need to perform a rival, and had thought, "What's your name?" She hadn't. She started digging in the morning. Her father had taught her this, the idea that information was the only currency that didn't devalue over time, that before you moved, you understood what you were standing on. She pulled everything publicly available on Thomas Alderton herself, not through an analyst, because she didn't want this becoming a story inside the building. Not yet. What she found was both more and less than she expected. Thomas Alderton had built Alderton Capital from a fund he'd started at 29, with a small group of investors who had believed in him for reasons the public record didn't fully explain. In 11 years, it had become one of the most consistently performing mid-sized firms in the country, not the flashiest, not the loudest, but in terms of actual returns, actual judgment, actual track record, exceptional. He was 38. He had a son named Kit. The mention of the boy appeared in a single regional business feature that Alderton had apparently agreed to, only because the publication donated its advertising proceeds to a reading program for kids in northern communities. The journalist had noted that he'd spent 6 weeks declining to be photographed before finally agreeing. Near the end of the piece, there was a quote she read twice. "I've never been interested in the appearance of good judgment. I'm interested in the actual thing." Most people spend significant energy on the former and wonder why the latter keeps escaping them. She set the article down. She stood at her office window with her arms crossed and looked at the river. He had walked into her boardroom with a paper bag from the lobby and let a room full of professionals escort him to reception. He'd known what he was testing. The question was whether the test was finished. She called Sylvie Okafor at 2 in the afternoon. 4 rings, then voicemail. Nadine left a message, composed, no audible panic, professional, saying she hoped they could speak before end of week. Sylvie called back 9 minutes later. "Mrs. Laurier," she said. "Just that. Thank you for calling back. I almost didn't." A pause. "What happened yesterday was not a reflection on your presentation. I know that, do you?" Sylvie's voice wasn't unkind, it was simply direct. Because from where I was sitting, the CEO of a company requesting significant capital investment didn't recognize who she was meeting with and didn't ask before having him redirected to reception. Nadine breathed. "That's accurate. I failed to identify him, and I deferred to my staff instead of taking a moment to understand the situation. That was my error." A longer pause this time. "He walks in without introduction on purpose," Sylvie said. "Every first meeting. He wants to see how a room responds to someone who doesn't look like money." Nadine absorbed that. "How did we compare to most rooms?" Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "Your junior associate was doing exactly what he'd been told. The others followed. That's a culture question, not an individual one." A breath. But it was the end of the meeting that he noticed. "He was watching you, Ms. Laurier, not Curtis. He was watching to see what you would do when the situation became clear, and I was already looking somewhere else." "Yes." Nadine stood at her window. A boat moved down the river, small against the gray water. "Is there anything I can do?" "Probably not," Sylvie said. "He doesn't reopen things, as a rule." A pause. "But he did ask me something this morning." Nadine waited. "He asked whether you made the call yourself or had someone do it for you." Nadine looked at her own name on the screen, calling from Nadine Laurier. "I called," she said. "I know," Sylvie said. "I told him that already." 3 days later, Renata came to her office at 4 in the afternoon and closed the door, which she only did when the news was the kind that shouldn't travel through glass walls. "I've been going through the Meridian numbers," Renata said. Meridian Infrastructure Partners had reached out the day after the Alderton withdrawal. Nadine had noted the timing but had filed it under unfortunate coincidence, the kind of thing that happened when a deal collapse became known and opportunists circled. She was reconsidering that filing now. Renata put a single sheet on the desk, covered in her small, precise handwriting. Meridian's primary backer through 2 holding companies is a group called Northgate Advisory Partners. She paused. Northgate was incorporated 20 months ago. Its registered agent is a firm in Westmount that has among its client list our board chair. Nadine looked at the paper. "How sure are you?" "I've been at this for 14 hours, Renata said. "I'm sure." Nadine nodded. The room was very still. Philip had pushed her toward the Alderton deal. "This is exactly the kind of capital partner we need." And when the deal had collapsed, he'd come back into the empty boardroom and put his hands on the table in that particular gesture and said, "We'll find another way." He'd already built the other way. "Don't tell anyone," Nadine said. "I haven't. Not yet. I need to think." She thought all night. At 7 the next morning, she was in the cafe on Saint Laurent she'd been going to for 3 years, the one with the exposed brick and the barista named Dina, who made her latte without needing to be told because Nadine always ordered the same thing. She was at the window table with her second coffee and a legal pad covered in handwriting when the door opened and a child walked in. He was maybe 9 or 10, with dark hair cut badly and a coat with the zipper pull missing. He was carrying a sketchbook pressed to his chest with both arms, the way you carry something you'd rather not be asked about. He looked around the cafe with the frank survey of a child who was entirely comfortable assessing spaces, then walked to the table 2 over from Nadine's, sat down, and opened the sketchbook without looking around again. She watched him for a moment. then went back to her legal pad. 2 minutes later, the door opened. She knew before she turned. Something in the room made the same adjustment it had made in the boardroom. That atmospheric shift, and she turned, and Thomas Alderton walked in with another Tim Hortons cup, the large one this time, and crossed to the table where the boy was sitting. He set the cup down, said something that made the boy look up briefly, then sit back and keep drawing. Thomas sat across from him and opened a slim notebook. He didn't look at Nadine. She looked at her legal pad for approximately 90 seconds, which was about 85 seconds longer than it took her to decide. She stood, she walked to their table. She waited until he looked up, 4 seconds, maybe 5, and when he did, his expression was exactly what she remembered. Unhurried, attentive, not unfriendly, not warm. "I owe you an apology," she said. She hadn't planned the phrasing, not a professional one, a real one. "What happened in that room was wrong, and it was wrong because I wasn't paying attention to what actually mattered. I let a situation manage itself instead of taking 30 seconds to understand it." Thomas looked at her. The boy kept drawing, but his pencil had slowed. "You made it easy for us to recognize you," she said, "and we still got it wrong. I'm sorry." Something moved across Thomas's face, not surprise. Something more considered. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The boy looked up then, briefly, with dark eyes that held the same quality of unhurried attention as his father's, and then looked back at the sketchbook. "This is Kit," Thomas said. The way he said the name told her most of what she needed to know about the weight he assigned it. "Hi, Kit," she said. Kit said nothing, but tilted the sketchbook a few degrees in her direction. On the page was the cafe, the counter, the chalkboard menu, Dina behind the bar, 3 customers at different tables. It was precise. It was genuinely good. "He draws everywhere we go," Thomas said, not apologetically, just stating it. "He drew the waiting room at his school once, and the principal asked to keep it." Nadine looked at Kit's bent head. Thomas looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "About your company." "Because you already left," she said. "You don't have a stake in this anymore. Which means if you tell me what you know, you're telling me for an honest reason." Silence. The cafe moved around them, Dina calling an order, the hiss of the steam wand, the sound of the street coming through the door each time it opened. Kit's pencil moved across the page. "Philip Sauve," Thomas said. The name landed between them like something that had been waiting. "He contacted us," Thomas said, 5 weeks before your meeting, through an intermediary. He communicated that the deal would be structured to include an advisory component for a consulting group connected to him, and that this was consistent with your company's approach to the partnership. He paused. "When I arrived that morning, I wasn't only evaluating your pitch. I was evaluating whether what I'd been told was accurate." Nadine was very still, and then I was redirected to reception, he said. "Not with satisfaction, simply as fact. I understand. I don't think you understand the full shape of it." He leaned forward slightly, the first change in his posture. "What Sauve told us, if it's true, means the deal was never going to close on your terms. He was going to engineer a renegotiation at the last minute that served him, not your company." Nadine looked at the table, then at Thomas. "Can you prove it?" "I can tell you what I know," he said. "What you do with that is your business. I mean that. It has to be your business." She understood the line he was drawing. She understood it was right. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Kit looked up then, turned the sketchbook toward Nadine, held it there for a moment. On the page, added to the cafe drawing, were 2 figures at a window table, facing each other. "Is that us?" she said. Kit examined the drawing with the detachment of someone evaluating their own work. "You both look like you're trying to figure something out," he said. "I draw people when they're thinking. It's more interesting than when they're just talking." Thomas made a sound that was almost a laugh. He caught it and held it, but not entirely. Nadine looked at the drawing, then at the boy who'd made it. Something shifted in the morning, not the problem, which was still there, solid and waiting, but something underneath it, some different current. She stood. She picked up her legal pad. "I have a lot of work to do," she said. "I know," Thomas said. She walked out into the November cold, which was already sharp in the way Montreal November was sharp, with intent, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started moving. 72 hours. She needed to be fast, and she needed to be right. She started walking. She walked 10 blocks before she slowed, because walking was the thing that had always helped her think, had been true since she was a kid doing laps around the pool deck while her teammates stretched inside. Motion gave her brain somewhere to go. Stillness gave the bad thoughts too much room. By the time she'd turned back toward the building, she had the list. What she had: Renata's documentation, Thomas's account of the intermediary approach, the timeline, Philip advocating for Alderton, the deal collapsing, Meridian appearing the next morning like something that had been staged in a waiting room. What she needed: the paper trail, The connection between Philip and Meridian that existed in documents, not inference. Something that would survive a board vote and a lawyer's counterargument. What she didn't have, time to be wrong. She pushed through the building's entrance, nodded at the desk, and took the elevator to 32. Jonah was already there. He looked up when she walked in, read her face, and asked no questions. "Block everything from 11 to end of day," she said. "Tell anyone who asks I'm in an off-site. You're not. You know that. I know that." He was already typing. "Philip called while you were out. He wants to advance the strategic review." Nadine stopped. When did he call? 8:51. 20 minutes after she'd left for coffee. 20 minutes after Thomas Alderton had presumably been visible to anyone paying attention. "Tell him the review is delayed to next week," she said. "Give him Thursday. Don't tell him why." She paused. "And if he asks, say I'm managing the fallout from the Alderton situation." "That's true." She went into her office and closed the door and did something she hadn't done since taking the chair. She went to the bottom drawer on the right, the deep one, and took out the binder her father had put together the year he'd handed things over. He'd called it the House Manual. Everything you needed if the house caught fire. Board structure, voting rights, override provisions. The specific language in the corporate charter about the removal of board members and the conditions required. She read for 2 hours. She ate an energy bar she found in the same drawer and didn't notice it had expired until she'd finished it. At 1 in the afternoon, Renata knocked. "You found something," Nadine said before she could speak. Renata sat down. She had the look she got when she'd been at a problem long enough that it had become personal. Philip has a personal financial management relationship with a firm called Callaway Wealth Partners. It's in the board's conflict of interest disclosure from 7 years ago. Standard stuff. Nobody looked twice at it because it wasn't relevant then. She put a printed page on the desk. Callaway Wealth is listed as a co-manager on 2 of the 3 funds inside Meridian Infrastructure Partners' capital structure. Nadine looked at the page. "That's not proof." "No," Renata said, "but it's the right kind of thread, the kind that has more attached to it." Nadine looked at her. "How much of our internal financials does Philip have access to?" Renata was quiet for a moment. "As chair, technically all of it." "So he knew our runway numbers?" "Yes." "He knew how much we needed the Alderton deal?" "Yes." Nadine leaned back. He manufactured the urgency and positioned himself to benefit from the failure. She said it out loud because hearing it outside her own head made it real in a different way. Renata looked at the window. "I need 3 years of records," Nadine said. "Every decision Philip had a hand in. Advisory contracts, vendors he recommended, deals that didn't close and what happened after. I need the pattern. That's going to take. I know how long it's going to take. That's why we start now." Renata nodded. She stood, then stopped at the door. "Nadine," she said it quietly, "when this is done, you should think about how it got this far without anyone seeing it." A pause, including us. Nadine held her gaze. "I know," she said. "Go." She watched Renata leave and then sat with that for a while, the idea that she'd been the one in the room running the company and had missed it. She'd been so focused on the external pressures, the runway, the pitch, the deal, that she hadn't been paying attention to the room she was already standing in. It was the same thing that had happened in the boardroom. She'd been watching the clock, and not the man by the window. She pulled up her email. The first message went to the company's external counsel, a woman named Adrienne Firth, who had been in corporate litigation for 25 years and had the manner of someone who'd cataloged every form of institutional bad behavior and stopped being surprised by any of them. 3 sentences. A request for a same-day call. The second email went to the head of IT security, a meticulous, quiet man named Patrick Howell, who'd been with the company since before Nadine had taken the chair. She asked him to pull access logs for the internal projection system 6 months back. No explanation. He would understand. Adrienne called back in 11 minutes. "I've been doing this long enough," Adrienne said, "that when a CEO sends me 3 sentences and asks to speak the same afternoon, I know what kind of afternoon it is. Talk." Nadine talked for 13 minutes. She laid out the structure, the connections, the timeline. She didn't use Philip's name yet. She said a senior board member, and Adrienne listened without interrupting. When she finished, the line was quiet. "How solid is the financial documentation?" Adrienne asked. "My CFO built it. It's solid. The account from the outside investor. Written? Verbal. First-hand, written would be better." Nadine thought of the cafe, of Thomas's voice, of the line he'd drawn clearly, and the reason for it. "I don't know if I can get it," she said honestly. "Here's what I need you to do," Adrienne said. "Don't confront the board member. Don't give any signal that you're looking. Get me everything in hard copy by Friday morning." A pause. "If what you're describing is accurate, we're looking at breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, possibly securities fraud, depending on the paper trail." Securities fraud. The phrase sat in the air. Who else knows? Adrian asked. My CFO. Me. The outside investor, though not the details of what we've found. Keep it that way. Every person you tell is a variable you cannot control. A pause. You're doing the right thing by coming to me now, Adrian said. The wrong thing would have been waiting until you were certain. No one is ever certain enough before they start. Something loosened in Nadine's chest, not relief, something more like recognition. She was no longer walking through this alone. Call me Friday, Adrian said, and hung up. Nadine looked at the clock, 3:12 in the afternoon. She'd been at this for 5 hours on coffee and an expired energy bar, and something that was either adrenaline or dread. Patrick Howell sent the access logs at 4:40. He attached one line at the bottom. There are anomalies you'll want to look at. Happy to walk you through them in person. She wrote back, tomorrow. 7:30, my office. Tell no one. He replied with a single word, understood. She went through the logs herself that evening after the floor had cleared, 2.5 hours. The anomalies Patrick had flagged were in the access records for the company's internal forecasting database, the one that held multi-year financial projections and the sensitivity models they used to evaluate deal structures. Someone had been pulling documents from that database over the past 9 months, carefully, at intervals, not in bulk, not obviously, the way you did it when you knew what you were doing and knew someone might check. The credentials belonged to an account registered to a third-party consultant retained by the board 18 months ago, a consultant whose engagement had been championed by the chair. She wrote down the consultant's name. She checked the time, 11:50. She drove home. She ate toast standing at the kitchen counter and stared at nothing. She lay on top of her bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling and tried to feel tired enough to sleep. She wasn't. Richard had been doing this for at least 18 months, probably longer. He had used his position, his access, and the trust of a board that had been there since before her time, a board she had inherited and never fully interrogated, to build something that served him at the expense of everything her father had spent 2 decades building. He had used the vulnerability of the transition. He had waited and watched and moved quietly. She thought about dinner 2 weeks before the Alderton meeting, when Philip had leaned across the table and said, "This is exactly the kind of capital partner we need," with what she had read as enthusiasm, and now understood as something else entirely. She fell asleep with the lights on and woke at 5:48, still in her clothes, her neck stiff from the angle, and she got up and made coffee and started again. That was Wednesday. Thursday was the day Philip called twice. The second call, at 2 in the afternoon, she picked up because not picking up twice in one day would register, and she needed him to think the temperature of the room hadn't changed. "Nadine," he said, with the particular warmth he kept for moments he needed something. "I've been worried about you. The Alderton situation, how are you holding up?" "Managing," she said. She kept her voice steady and slightly tired, the tone of a CEO navigating the aftermath of a collapsed deal, which was, in its own way, accurate. "These things happen," he said. "I have to say, I think Meridian might actually be a stronger fit for where we're trying to go. More flexibility, less rigidity in the terms." He was selling Meridian to her, casually, like a colleague's suggestion, 2 days after she'd found the thread connecting him to their primary backer. She gripped the edge of the desk under the table. "I'm still reviewing their materials," she said. "Of course, but I wouldn't take too long. These windows close." A pause. "Lunch Friday? We could talk it through properly." She said she'd check her schedule. When the call ended, she set the phone down and sat very still, and then said quietly to the empty office a single sentence she would not repeat in a room with glass walls. She went back to work. Friday evening, the first full compilation from Renata arrived. 94 pages, tabbed, annotated. Nadine read it that night at her kitchen table, highlighter in hand, building the version that Adrian would need to work with. What emerged was not one thing but many, layered over each other. Advisory contracts with vendors who had quiet connections to Philip's network. A consulting arrangement that had paid out substantially beyond its stated scope. And an acquisition from 2 years ago. A company that would have been excellent for Laurier Environmental, strategically and financially, with numbers that were clearly sound, that had been killed at the board level on Philip's recommendation. That company had been acquired 8 months later by a firm that, if you followed the thread far enough, had a co-investment arrangement with an entity linked to Philip's consulting group. He hadn't only been working against the Alderton deal, he'd been harvesting the company for years. She sat at the table until midnight. Then she went to bed and set her alarm for 6, and slept better than she had in 2 weeks, which surprised her. But the night before, the hardest thing was often the best sleep she'd found, like the body having accepted what was coming, finally let go. Adrian arrived at her office at 9 Saturday morning carrying a briefcase and an expression that said she'd already been through the documents Nadine had sent the night before. "Here's where we are," she said before she'd fully sat down. She laid it out with precision. What they had was substantial, significant enough to bring to the board, but not yet airtight. What they needed was either a paper record of the intermediary approach on the Alderton deal or additional documentation linking Philip directly to the financial extractions across the 2-year timeline. "The access logs matter," Adrian said. "The consultant account is a real thread. If we can show that Sov directed the consultant's work, we argue the access was his by proxy." She tapped the bound report. "And this acquisition story, if we can demonstrate that he killed a sound deal and then benefited when someone else made it, that's not coincidence. That's a course of conduct. What about the Alderton intermediary?" Adrienne looked at her. "Can you get something in writing from him?" Nadine thought about the cafe, about Thomas's voice, about the line he'd drawn and why. "I don't know," she said honestly. He was clear about staying out of it. "I'm not asking you to push him. But if he's willing, even a written account of what he observed, not a declaration, just a documented account, it changes the weight of what we're bringing." Adrian paused. "The board can act without it, but an external source changes the conversation." Nadine looked at the window. He hadn't said he wouldn't help. He'd said it had to be her business first. He'd needed her to carry it to the point where it was something she'd built and owned. She thought she might have reached that point. "I'll reach out," she said. "No promises." After Adrian left, she sat for 10 minutes. Then she found the number she'd saved under Okafor, Alderton Capital, and typed a message. She kept it short, said she needed 15 minutes of his time if he was willing, that it wasn't about the deal, that she'd explain when they spoke. She put the phone down, looked at the river. It buzzed. His reply was 4 words. "Tomorrow. Same cafe. 8, she exhaled. In 72 hours, the pattern she'd uncovered would reach the point where it couldn't be held quietly anymore. She'd gotten there herself, mapped it, documented it, retained counsel, built the case from the ground up. She hadn't waited for someone to save the company. She hadn't let her pride keep her from asking for help when help was the right thing to ask for. She put the phone face down on the desk and went back to the documents. There was still work to do. Sunday morning arrived the way the ones before something big always do. Too clear, too still. The sky over the river a pale December blue that made everything look more defined than usual. Thomas came in at 8 exactly, alone. Kit was presumably at his weekend robotics program. Thomas had mentioned it once and she'd filed it away without knowing she had. He ordered at the counter, exchanged a few words with Dina, and came to her table. He looked at the documents she'd set out. He looked at her face. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough," she said, "but I can prove it." She told him what she needed. Not testimony, not a legal filing. A written account of the intermediary approach, what was said, when, by whom. Thomas wrapped his hands around his coffee and looked at the window for a moment. The street outside was starting to move, weekend pace, people with somewhere gentle to be. "Who's your lawyer?" he said. "Adrienne Firth." Something shifted in his expression. "I know, Adrienne. She's good, I know." He was quiet for a moment. Nadine waited. She'd been getting better at waiting, which was not her natural state and which had cost her something to learn. "The intermediary's name is Drew Callahan," Thomas said. "He positions himself as a deal facilitator. He's been connected to at least 2 other situations I'm aware of where a board-level insider used him to redirect investor interest." He looked at her directly. "I can give you a written account of the approach. Date, substance, exact terms communicated. I can tell you what was said and what was implied. Sylvie will have everything to Adrian by end of day." Nadine held his gaze. "That's exactly what I need." He nodded once. Then, "One condition." "What's the condition?" "You're the one who presents this to the board," he said. "Not Adrian, not Renata. You walk in there and you put it on the table yourself." She looked at him. She almost said, "Of course." She stopped herself because it wasn't of course, and he knew that, and she knew it, and of course would have been the easy version of what he was asking. "I know," she said. "It has to be me." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. They sat for a while in the morning quiet, the cafe moving around them, and Nadine thought about the board meeting waiting on the other side of this weekend, about Philip at his end of the table, about walking into that room with what she'd built and putting it down herself. She was afraid. That was honest. She was afraid and she was going anyway, and that was the only kind of courage she'd ever believed in. She stood. She looked at Thomas. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say "you're welcome." He said, "Don't let him leave that room with anything left standing." She held that for a second. Then she nodded. She walked out into the December morning, and the city was already awake around her, cold and full and indifferent in the way cities were indifferent, Not hostile, just vast, just ongoing, and somewhere on the other side of the weekend was the hardest room she'd ever had to walk into. She was going to be ready. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday at 10. Nadine had submitted the formal request Sunday evening through the legal channel, listing Adrian and Renata as witnesses. By 9 that night, she'd had 4 confirmations. By 10:45, 5. Phillips had come in at 11:32, late, which told her he'd spent 90 minutes deciding whether to appear. He appeared. At 9:58, Nadine took the elevator from 31 to 32 alone. She wrote it in silence and thought about nothing specific. She was past the thinking stage now. She was in the doing stage, and the doing stage required a different part of her, the part that went quiet and moved forward. The boardroom looked exactly as it always had. The long table, the river outside. The chair in the corner where Thomas Alderton had never sat. She set her documents at the head of the table. Her chair, she'd decided that already. The room filled, Adrian to her left, Renata across, the other 5 board members, 2 independent directors, the company's general counsel, the audit committee chair. Philip arrived at 10:01. Charcoal jacket, pale blue shirt, the combination she recognized as his meeting clothes. He came in with warmth moving through the room ahead of him. The handshakes, the brief asides, the easy competence of someone who'd been working this room for 7 years. He looked at her sitting at the head of the table. Something crossed his face fast. Then the warmth came back. "Nadine," he said, taking his seat. "Unusual format." "It is," she said. "Thank you for making the time," she began. She did it the way Adrian had outlined. The timeline first, the pattern before the name. She walked the board through the access logs, through the consultant account, through the 9 months of careful extractions from the internal forecasting system. She watched the faces, the audit chair's expression tightening, one of the independent directors leaning forward, the general counsel going very still. She did not look at Philip. She presented the advisory contracts. She walked through the acquisition from 2 years ago, killed on Philip's recommendation, sound by every financial measure, picked up 8 months later by a connected firm. She heard Philip shift in his chair. She presented the Northgate connection, the holding companies, the registered agent with ties to Philip's personal financial services firm. "I'd like to pause here," Philip said. His voice was calibrated, smooth. "I think there's context missing, and I'd like to. Under the emergency disclosure provision in the corporate charter," Nadine said, without raising her voice, "an active integrity disclosure by a sitting CEO may not be interrupted until the disclosure is complete. I'd ask you to hold your response until I've finished." She looked at him directly. "Thank you, Philip." The room went very quiet. She held his gaze for exactly the length of time required. Then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented the Alderton account last. A written statement from an external investment principal, obtained voluntarily, documenting an intermediary approach made 5 weeks before the partnership meeting. She did not say Thomas's name. She read 3 excerpts. The first named Drew Callahan and described the approach. The second detailed the terms communicated and who had been represented as authorizing them. The third documented the date and the specific structure, a structure that had never appeared in any version of the deal Nadine had prepared or approved. She set the document down. She looked at the room. The audit chair was looking at Philip. So were both independent directors. The general counsel had stopped writing. Philip looked at Nadine. This was the moment Adrian had described. She saw it happen, the lean forward, the expression recalibrating toward something that wanted to read as wounded reasonableness. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across dinner tables and boardroom tables for 6 years, the look she'd always read as collegial, as someone on her side. She saw it now for what it was. She looked back. She did not look away. "These are serious allegations," Philip said. His voice had lost some of its smoothness, just at the edges, "and I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we have is a series of circumstantial connections and a statement from an unnamed source, presented by a CEO who is, understandably, under considerable stress following a very public deal collapse." He looked around the table. "What this company needs right now is perspective, Michael," Nadine said, addressing the general counsel. "Would you read the fiduciary duty provision from Section 8? Michael read it. It was 13 words with very little room for interpretation. A pattern of conduct documented across 22 months, with financial benefit to connected parties at each juncture, meets the threshold for emergency review under that provision, Nadine said. She addressed the full table. "I'm not asking this board to convict anyone. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of every transaction, advisory contract, and deal recommendation involving the board chair over the past 3 years. That's the appropriate next step." She paused. I'm also moving, under the emergency provision, that Philip Sov recuse himself from all board activities pending the outcome of that audit. Silence, the kind that had weight. Philip put both hands on the table. I have given 6 years to this company, he said. 6 years, and I think the people in this room know what my commitment. Lynette. The voice came from the far end of the table. One of the independent directors, a woman named Lynette Bremer, 71 years old, who had been on the board since before Nadine's father had his surgery and who spoke so rarely in these rooms that when she did, everyone listened. She was looking at the audit chair. I think we've heard what we need to hear. I'd like to move to a vote. Philip looked at Lynette. Lynette looked back. Something collapsed in his face. Not dramatically, not like a scene in a film. More like watching a structure develop a fault line. Still standing, still trying to hold its shape, but something fundamentally shifted in how the weight was sitting. The vote took 4 minutes. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 5-1. The motion for Philip's recusal pending the audit passed 5-1. The single vote against both motions was Philip's own. He cast it looking straight ahead. Then he stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Nadine and she looked at him, and the room was very quiet. You're making a significant mistake, he said, quietly. The voice under the voice, the one she'd never heard before, which was smaller and harder than the one he used for rooms. I don't think I am, she said. He left. The door closed. Nadine stood at the head of the table and felt the room reconfigure. Board members who had been sitting rigid were leaning back now. The audit chair was already on her phone. Renata was writing quickly. Adrian gathered her documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had more work to do. Lynette caught Nadine's eye from across the table, said nothing, gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried more than a sentence. Nadine nodded back. She stood at the head of the table until the room had mostly cleared, and then she sat down because her legs needed her to. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. Adrian sat back down across from her. You held the room, she said. I held the room, Nadine said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. After Adrian left, Renata stayed. She sat across from Nadine with the particular expression that followed hard things. Slightly hollowed out, slightly relieved, more tired than an hour ago. It's going to go public, Renata said. Probably Wednesday, I know. Employees first, before press, before investors. The people in this building hear it from me before they read it anywhere else. Renata nodded. Your father would have done it the same way. Nadine looked at her. Renata wasn't a sentimental person. The remark carried weight because of that. Thank you, Nadine said, for all of it. After Renata left, she sat in the empty boardroom for a long time. She looked at the chair where Philip had been sitting, pushed back from the table at the angle a person leaves when they stand in a hurry. She looked at the chair in the corner that Thomas Alderton had never occupied. She thought about a drawing of 2 figures at a cafe window, both of them trying to figure something out. She thought about Thomas saying, "Don't let him leave that room with anything left standing." She thought about the look on Philip's face in those last few seconds, the fault line, the weight shifting. She'd done it. She'd walked in and she'd laid it on the table herself, and she'd held the room and Philip Sov had left it with nothing. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to feel triumphant, and she didn't. What she felt was the particular exhaustion of having used herself completely, not from failure but from the opposite. She reached into her bag. She typed a text to Thomas. Board voted. Audit authorized. He recused. I held the room. She put the phone down. Looked at the river. It buzzed. 3 words. I know you did. She looked at it for a moment. She thought it was something more than reassurance, the particular confidence of someone who had assessed another person carefully and was not surprised by the result. She had a company to run. She picked up her bag and walked out into the rest of it. The audit concluded on a Tuesday in late January. Sandra Voss delivered the final report herself. She came in at 9 in the morning with her briefcase and her dispassionate precision and sat across from Nadine, Renata, and Adrian and walked them through it section by section. The numbers were worse than Nadine had expected. Philip Sov had been redirecting company resources, deal flow, and confidential strategic information for the benefit of connected parties for a period of not 3 years but closer to 5.5. The acquisition Nadine had flagged was one of 3 such instances. The advisory contracts represented excess payments of approximately $1.9 million over market rate, routed through entities that traced, at varying distances, back to Philip's network. The Alderton deal had been specifically engineered to fail, to create the opening for Meridian and the extraction structure he'd arranged around it. 5.5 years. Nadine sat with that number while Sandra spoke. She had taken the chair 6 years ago. Philip had been doing this before her. He'd been building it before her father's second surgery, before the transition, before everything she'd come to think of as the period that had defined her tenure. He hadn't taken advantage of the transition's vulnerability. He'd been there already, and the transition had given him better cover. She kept her face neutral while Sandra finished. She knew where to put what she was feeling. She'd learned that across 12 weeks of audit and press inquiries and board meetings, and she put it there now, in the place where things that needed to be felt waited until there was room for them. After Sandra and Adrian had gone, Renata stayed. The room was quiet. The river outside was gray-white with the January light. 5.5 years, Renata said. Yes, your father never knew. No. Nadine looked at the report on the desk. He didn't. Is that better or worse? She thought about it honestly. Both, she said, at the same time. Renata nodded, the kind of nod that accepted a thing that didn't resolve cleanly. Nadine thought it was one of the better adjustments a person could make over the course of a hard year. We have 408 employees, Nadine said. The company is standing, and Philip Sov is going to spend the next several years in legal proceedings he built for himself. A pause. I'm going to try to concentrate on those things. That's the right order, Renata said. After Renata left, Nadine picked up her phone, typed a text to Thomas. Audit done. Full report. 5.5 years, not 3. Company is okay. I'm okay. His reply came in 3 minutes. I know you are. Coffee Saturday? She looked at the January light through the window, looked at the report on her desk, looked at the chipped handle mug that had been on her desk through every late night and hard morning of the past 3 months, surviving by virtue of being too familiar to notice until you needed something to look at. She typed back, yes. The referral to the appropriate authorities was submitted Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, it was public. Her phone ran for 6 hours. She did one statement, 8 sentences, nothing she didn't have evidence for, and let Jonah handle the rest with a set of prepared responses. At 5, her mother called. I'm watching the news, her mother said. I know, he looks like someone's favorite uncle. He did, Nadine said. That was part of it. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Are you through the worst of it? Nadine thought about how to answer that honestly. The worst part is done, she said. The rest is just process. It takes time, but it's not the same kind of hard. What's different about the second kind? Nadine looked at the window. The first kind, you're fighting something. The second kind, you're just doing the work. Her mother made a sound that meant she understood. Come in spring, she said. I'll make your dad's tourtière. I'll come in April. April, her mother said, in the tone of someone who knew April would get away from them if they weren't specific. April, Nadine said. I mean it. After the call, she sat at her desk and let herself feel the full weight of it. The 5.5 years. The audit, the report, the referral, the statement. And underneath all of it, the plain fact that the company was still standing, and the 408 people who came to work in this building still had jobs, and what her father had spent 2 decades building had not been allowed to die quietly inside someone else's arrangement. She'd done that. Saturday morning, she was at the cafe by 7:50, which she recognized as telling. You arrived early for things that mattered. Dina made her latte without being asked, and she took the window table and watched the winter street and let her mind go quiet, which was its own kind of luxury. Thomas came in at 8 exactly. Kit was at his robotics class. He had the usual coffee and he sat down across from her and looked at her for a moment. You look different, he said. It's over, she said, the first part. He nodded. He understood distinctions without needing them mapped. How are you, he said. The real version of the question. She thought about it. Tired in a way that's okay, she said. The kind after something ends, not during it. She paused. Lighter than I expected. Which might be delay, or might be accurate. Might be both, he said. Might be both. She looked at her coffee. I keep coming back to the 5.5 years, that it went on that long inside a company I was running. You took the chair at 31, he said. Inheriting a board that had been in place for years, navigating a transition, running a company your family built. You were finding your footing. You saw it when you were positioned to see it. That feels like a way of being kind about it. It feels that way, he said. It isn't. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, a man walked past with a retriever that was very committed to stopping, and a person on the other end of the leash who was very committed to continuing, and the physics of this played out on the sidewalk in a way that was hard not to watch. I've been thinking about the proposal, she said. He went still. Attentive. Not the same one. Not October's pitch. She looked at him directly. I've spent the past 3 months rebuilding the financial architecture, the governance structure, the board oversight process. The company looks different than it did when we first sat across from each other. Better. I want to bring you a proposal built on what it actually is now, not on what I needed it to seem like when I was managing a crisis." She paused. "I'm telling you it's coming so that when I walk in, you know it's a real proposal, not a gesture." He was quiet for a moment. "I know it wouldn't be a gesture," he said, "but I understand why you needed to say it." She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. "Kit wants you to come see the drawing he did of that morning," Thomas said. "The one at the cafe. He finished it last week. It's considerably larger now." "How large?" "He used 3 pieces of paper taped together." She looked at him. "He taped them?" "He was committed to the scale." She smiled. "The actual one, not the boardroom one. Tell him I'll come see it." "He'll want you to tell him yourself," Thomas said. "He's particular about that." She understood. She thought Kit was particular about a lot of things, and that this was one of his better qualities. "Saturday after next," she said. "Saturday after next," he said. They stayed until 9:15. The conversation moved, the way conversations moved between people who had known each other through the hard version of something and were now learning the shape of the easier version, which wasn't without its own adjustments. You didn't go through what they'd gone through and come out the other side without carrying the texture of it. But the texture wasn't bad. It was just real. She left at 9:20. He walked to the cafe door with her. They stood on the sidewalk in the January cold, the particular cold that came off the river, and there was a moment between them of the threshold quality that their conversations had often had, the space between one thing and the next. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. You've heard that from me before. You don't have to keep saying it. I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "I want to." Something in his face did the thing it sometimes did, the slight change, warmer and more specific than before. The look of a person who has decided to stop being careful about what shows. "Saturday after next," he said. "Saturday after next," she said. She walked to the corner. She didn't look back, not because she wasn't thinking about it, but because she'd learned to walk toward things instead of checking whether they were following. She turned the corner and the cafe disappeared behind the building's edge, and she was in the city again. The January air and the weekend quiet, and the particular feeling of a Saturday morning that had been good without her having needed to arrange it. She had a company to rebuild, a board to reconstitute properly, an audit process to overhaul, a governance framework to make structurally sound, and 408 people whose security was her responsibility. The work was what it had always been. Demanding and unglamorous and occasionally impossible. But there was a drawing taped together from 3 pieces of paper waiting to be seen, and a boy who would want to hear it from her directly, and a Saturday she'd already said yes to. She walked through the cold toward all of it. That had always been the whole thing, not the arriving, but the walking toward. The willingness to keep going when the room was hard, the ability to be wrong and say so out loud, the courage to ask for help without mistaking that for weakness. She'd learned all of it the hard way, over a winter she wouldn't have chosen and wouldn't trade. She kept walking.